Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 4, our final session in our seminar on snitches and sellouts. A lot of S's today. Our final seminar for September on snitches and sellouts. So welcome to our session. We're going to kind of wrap everything up today. Our focus will primarily be on sellouts today. Last week it was primarily on snitches, so we looked at people that betrayed revolutionary movements and social movements in the 20th century, going from the U.S. and also talking about anti-colonial movements in Africa and even the anti-apartheid movement. Today we're going to focus primarily, actually solely on the African continent. We might touch a little bit on Haiti, but we're looking at sellouts. We're looking at leaders since the mid-20th century, so since the 1960s and moving into, we'll actually go up to today's time and look at these leaders in Africa that have allied themselves with interests that are against the masses of African people. So foreign officials and others that are against African people. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. This was our last session in this seminar. Next week, October, begins our seminar on, not a seminar, excuse me, our course on Sheroes, African Women of Resistance, that will go for 8 weeks. I'll talk more about that at the end of this class, but that's what you can look forward to. So, I also want to acknowledge Monday is National Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada. Some people have the day off, and it's a day to reflect on the experiences of Indigenous people, First Nations folks in Canada. Really important for African people. I've talked about this in previous sessions of this class. When you're in a settler colony like we are in Canada, in the United States, or anywhere else, Australia, anywhere that's a settler colony, it's important that to be just, you ally yourself with the indigenous people that are there. So when we think about this day and we think about black folks' position in the settler colony, how the settler colony has treated us, how we interact with it, we have to be mindful of that relationship, the just relationship between African people and indigenous people. We have to think about what truth and reconciliation actually is, because the truth of the matter is, we're in the settler colony. Now, how do you reconcile that? What does true reconciliation mean? It's not just, having land acknowledgements. It's actually having policies that give the land back. It's actually policies that create a situation where indigenous people are actually in control of their own destinies. And if that means dismantling the settler colony, it may mean that. And African people will have a decision to make. As I mentioned in previous classes, are you a migrant or are you a settler? Because those are two different identities and two different political responsibilities. So I just want to say that because I'm constantly reminded that we're in a settler colony. And as African people talking about snitches and sellouts and social movements and all these things, it's important for us to think about what are we going to do on Monday? Are we going to engage with our indigenous brothers and sisters and others in their struggle, or are we just going to ignore it and keep going about our business like we always do? So just something to keep in mind. And I can't teach that course. I know a little bit about it, but if you look at indigenous history and indigenous people's movements, they got their own snitches and sellouts too. And it's really fascinating when you get into it. I'm not as familiar with indigenous Canadian history. I know a little bit, much more familiar with the political movements in the United States with indigenous people. And you got figures like Dickie Wilson, who was a quote unquote tribal leader in North Dakota. Was it North Dakota? Yeah, North Dakota, where he, just wreak, wreaked havoc on the folks up there, working hand in hand with the U.S. government to destroy dissent and torture people, and he used goons to attack people. So this phenomena of folks snitching and selling out and betraying social movements is not something that's peculiar to African people. This happens in many social movements and many fights for justice. But it's important for African people to look at our own experiences to figure out how we can kind of stop this experience or minimize its presence as much as possible. All right, so we could talk more about that in open discussion. I just wanted to acknowledge what's coming up on Monday. So, we're going to talk about some of the most egregious cases of selling out among neo-colonial, quote-unquote, leaders. And then we'll talk about what we can learn from these cases. So we talked about enslavement. We talked about colonization. We talked about the resistance to colonization. And ultimately, in the mid-20th century, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then culminating in 1994 with the end of apartheid, the fight against colonization. And what emerged were new states, new independent nations in Africa. Now, these leaders had a choice to make as they were preparing to take over territories that had been ravaged by colonial exploitation. The choice was, do I honor, respect, and promote the feelings and the desires of the masses of the population, or do I line my own pockets, rule in my own interest, often at the behest of the West? So a lot of leaders had that decision to make. Some of them, unfortunately, decided to go with the latter. They decided they were going to use their position as leaders, whether they were elected or, as we'll see, as if they came in through a military takeover, they decided to use that position to enrich themselves, the close circle of supporters and family, at the expense of the masses. And oftentimes, that was in tandem with the interest of Western powers, former colonizers, and the new player on the scene, the United States, which only had one colony in Africa, Liberia, which we talked about in week 2, and wasn't necessarily seen as a colonizing power because of the myth that Liberia wasn't a colony, even though, if you paid attention in week 2, we talked about how Liberia was a settler colony of the United States, manned by snitches and sellouts. So America wasn't seen as a traditional colonizer at the end of the beginning of the Cold War, the beginning of the independence movement in Africa. But leaders would eventually find out that, no, this is the new leader of neo-colonialism. When Western Europe was weak as a result of World War II, it was the United States that rebuilt Western Europe. It was the United States that told England and France, get yourself together so that we can continue this exploitation of African labor and resources. And the United States led that effort through its intelligence, through its military power, through its economic power. So we're going to see how that played out in a couple of cases. We're going to actually connect to the first sellout that we talked about with our first case, because we're going to be looking at Central Africa and we're going to be looking at the Congo. Now, even though the Kingdom of Congo was located in primarily what's now the Republic of Congo and Angola, the ramifications of what Afonso did all the way back in the early 16th century let the floodgates open for what would happen in the 20th century. By Afonso selling out to the Portuguese, working with the Portuguese in order to get the throne of the Kingdom of Congo, he opened the door for the process of enslavement in that region. That process of enslavement would weaken that region in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, to the point that Central Africa is being ravaged from both sides. The Atlantic slave trade is sending millions of people to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to North America. And then on the east, you have Africans that have sold out to Arab and Western Asian and even Eastern Asian interests, and they're enslaving Africans in the eastern part of the Congo and shipping them into the eastern slave trade that went across the Indian Ocean, which actually lasted a lot longer than the slave trade that we're more familiar with that goes to the west. Because this one actually starts a couple of centuries earlier, in the 9th century, actually 8th century. So for 1,000 years, you had Africans going from East Africa to places like Iraq, Persia, which would become Iran, Turkey, and even as far east as Japan, India. So Africans are being exported that way. For military service, they're being involuntarily transported for sexual slavery, both men and women going to the east. So Central Africa, because of the Western slave trade and the Eastern slave trade, is being ravaged into the 19th century, the 1800s. And this territory is now a prize for the European colonizers. That again, they're not interested anymore in exporting African labor out of the continent to be exploited. They want to exploit African labor on the continent and African resources on the continent. That's the goal of colonization. So this Central African region becomes a prize. And again, it's already weakened because of the slave trade going to the west and the east. Whenever there's a slave trade going on, wars are being instigated in order for captives to be obtained. When there's wars and there's insecurity, economics suffers because people don't feel confident trading with each other. So all of that is in decline by the time we get to the 19th century. You still have some major kingdoms there, the Luba Kingdom, the Kuba Kingdom, and others, but it's not as powerful as they should be. It's not as secure as the area should be because of these two slave trades that are occurring on both sides of the territory. So in steps the King of Belgium, Leopold, King Leopold, and he's seeing England gobbling up territory in Africa, France gobbling up territory in Africa. And again, we talked about this over the past couple of weeks, particularly in week 2. The Europeans would come, they would either conquer outright, which really wasn't always the tactic. The tactic was to go in, find a sellout, create a relationship with that sellout, get that sellout to turn his territory into, his or her territory into a protectorate, which basically says I'm under European protection, and then that would transform into a colony. So England is doing this, France is doing this, later on Italy, Germany, they're all doing this, they're all engaged in this process. Portugal, who's been there forever since, again, Alfonso. Little Belgium in Europe wants their piece of this magnificent African cake. And he sees this territory of the Congo. And Leopold says, I want that. But how am I going to get it? I don't really have a big, strong army in Europe. I can't take on France or England. How am I going to get this? I'll do it diplomatically. So what Leopold did is something that you see leaders in the 21st century do. They hide their ravenous intentions under humanitarian guise. So Leopold says to the other European leaders, he says to the wider world, I want to create in Central Africa a place that is free from slavery and free from the slave trade. Look, because now the West is, again, they're easing themselves out of the slave trade. You know, England was first, the rest of the Western powers, and then Africans, of course, fighting against the slave trade in Brazil, of course, Haiti, which we talked about, Jamaica, the U.S., all of these places. So slavery is on its way out. Chattel slavery is on its way out. So for the European ears, this sounds great. We're going to end the slave trade. And now the new villains of slavery are the quote-unquote Arabs. And when they say Arabs, they're really talking about Africans that have adopted an Arab identity, people like a man by the name of Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip was an African slave trader in East Africa that, again, was operating in the Congo and other areas around the Great Lakes in Africa and capturing people and putting them in slavery. So he was the prime enemy of abolitionists in the world in the 19th century. They were looking at this guy, Tipu Tip, and the Arab slave trade in East Africa, and they're saying, this is wrong, even though Europeans had benefited for centuries off slavery. Now, when they decide they're going to move in a different productive system, now slavery is wrong. So you see how it works. When you're doing it, it's cool, but when someone else is doing it, no, it's not right. So that becomes the enemy. So Leopold says, we got to put an end to slavery. It's wrong. It's a humanitarian crisis, and this slave trade is destroying African people. Because I love African people. As I said, you know, they're little savages. Now, of course, none of these Europeans think that Africans are equal, and this was another reason for colonization. Africans are childlike savages. They need to be taken care of. They need to be brought into civilization. They need to be exposed to Christianity, exposed to Western education. These are the things to save these heathens running around in the dark African continent, which they didn't know a lot about. That's why they're sending missionaries and explorers, and the European powers are financing this so they can get an understanding of what's in Central Africa. So Leopold is presenting himself as this humanitarian. He's going to end the slave trade in the Congo. And in addition to that, he's also going to create the area to be free from slavery, but also free for business. He goes to other European powers and he's like, look, you all have your own spheres of influence in Africa, and you have made them exclusive. So, in what will become Nigeria, starting out with the Lagos colony, England controlled that. France can't trade in there. Germany can't trade in there. Italy can't trade in there. It's just for England. And then when France takes control of Algeria, they say, this is ours. England, you can't trade with Algeria, or Madagascar. You can't trade with Madagascar. This is ours. Leopold says, listen, I'm going to let this territory be open for everybody to trade in. I'll control it, but everybody can trade. England, you can trade. Your businesses can operate there. France, Germany, Italy, you all can come in and trade. It's big enough for everybody to come in and set up their businesses. I won't let it'll be a free area, the Congo free zone. So other European powers, they're happy for this, because England doesn't want France to get the Congo because they know they won't be able to do business there. France doesn't want England to get it, so on and so forth. So they say, well, if little Belgium gets it, that's cool because we all can operate there. So he was able to convince the other European powers to allow his little tiny kingdom of Belgium to control an area almost 40 times its size as his personal property. So this wasn't even your typical colonial project where the state, England or France or Germany or Italy, took control of the area. The Congo was essentially given to Leopold as his personal property, like his backyard, like his personal property. It wasn't even under the control of the Belgian government at first. What happens? Leopold and his agents get there, and these businesses get there with no intention of stopping slavery. They want the Arabs out of the way. That way they can exploit African labor in the region. They don't want African labor to leave, because what they found, the original intent with the Congo, what Leopold originally saw when he looked at the Congo, he saw an area rich with ivory. He wanted to exploit it for ivory, possibly gold and diamonds. They weren't really sure exactly what was in it. They still needed to send explorers and missionaries to go in to find out what was actually there, but they knew ivory was there. Rhinoceros horns, elephant tusks, all of that. That's what they wanted. That was the gold. But when they get there, they realize there's something even more precious there that they can make even more money on, which is rubber. The rubber trees. These huge trees with these huge vines, and you tap the vines, and a sap comes out, and that sap can be turned into rubber. And again, this is toward the end of the 19th century. Bicycles are being mass-produced. Tires for bicycles. Automobiles will start to be mass-produced at the end of the 19th century. So you're going to need rubber for tires, rubber for the machines that are operating in Europe's industrial factories. So rubber becomes incredibly important. So now Leopold is saying, we're going to exploit this place to the fullest. So as he sends his companies that get licensed to operate there, they hired their own professional armies. They force Africans to join these armies. They bring in mercenaries from other places to come and force kingdoms to either comply or be destroyed. They force villages to collect rubber by kidnapping all the women and children and say, we're going to kill all these people unless you go out into that forest, climb up those trees, tap those rubber trees, and you have a quota to meet. And if you don't meet the quota, we're going to kill your children. We're going to kill or rape the women and sell them into slavery. Or we're cutting off one of your hands. We're cutting off ears. We're cutting off noses. This is the type of exploitation that would occur in the Congo. So between 1885 and 1908, 5 to 8 million Congolese people were killed. 5 to 8 million Congolese people were killed in this time period. Again, a Holocaust that most people don't even pay attention to. 6 million people died in the Holocaust that happened in Europe. 5 to 8 million people died in Congo. These are just the people that are killed. These aren't the people that died from disease, malnutrition, all these things that spread as a result of this intense violence. These are just the people that were killed, 5 to 8 million. So, and then this doesn't count the people that got their hands cut off by the Belgians. This was a sign because this was the most egregious example of colonial exploitation in Africa, the most egregious. Because again, this wasn't a government, this wasn't like France or England in control of this area. This area was opened up to businesses that had their own personal militaries, personal security forces with no accountability to anybody. Rape was rampant, murders, whole villages being burnt to the ground, people just being disappeared. Hell on earth is the only way to describe it. This is very similar to the situation in 18th century and early 19th century Haiti. Essentially hell on earth for the Africans that lived there. So while all this is going on, you do have people that eventually go there and speak out. Some of the first people to speak out were African-American explorers and missionaries, people like William Shepard and George Washington Williams, who, you know, they heard the humanitarian call of King Leopold. So they go to the Congo thinking that they're fighting against slavery. And you got to remember, this is the 1880s. Black Americans had just got free in 1865. So when they hear, oh, slavery is still going on, I'm going to go fight against it. So they get there, they realize, wait a minute, there's no fight against slavery. This is slavery. So they start writing and talking about what was going on and exposing the situation. It was very courageous for them to do so. But it continues to go on. And again, you got sellouts. Now, I'm hesitant to call a lot of these people sellouts, because what you see here is you see a man being whipped with a rope made out of hippo skin. They would make whips out of hippo skin. And when that thing hits you, it would rip your flesh off. And some of these people were forced to do this. So I put sellout in with an asterisk, because not all of these people that did this were sellouts. The situation was, look, we're going to kill you, burn down your entire village unless you serve as a security force against this other village. And people had to make that choice. Do I want my family killed? Do I want to be in a situation, or am I going to be this? But then there were some people that came from other parts of Africa and came from other regions of the Congo that willingly joined these security forces, the Force Publique in French. This was the original colonial army of the Congo, or what would become the Belgian Congo. These were Africans recruited from as far away as Nigeria and other places to serve as mercenaries in the Congo to exploit other people and folks that were in the Congo. So again, some of these people were forced to join this force and commit these atrocities at the risk of these atrocities being committed against them. And then some people just signed up because it was a job and they decided to do this. Those are the people that we should cast blame on in all this. So again, these are just some of the images that came out. Children, people with their hands cut off, because these folks in these force, they had superiors, white superiors. And the white superiors would say, we gave you guns, we gave you weapons, we want proof that you're carrying out the job. So if the rubber quota isn't met, we want to know why and what you did to the people to punish them for not collecting all that rubber. So what they would do is they would count hands. There'd be baskets of hands that would have been amputated. People got their hands cut off, and they would say, this is proof that we've been doing our job. It's like at the end, I hate to make this comparison, but they say sometimes police, at the end of the month, they have a ticket quota. So if you're in an area where there's a lot of police, toward the end of the month, they'll start handing out more tickets because they have to show to their superior that, yeah, I've been doing my job, watching people speed and all that type of stuff. Here, it was hands. They had to submit so many hands and say, yeah, I've been doing my job. And sometimes, because it's easier to get a hand off a dead body, they would just kill people and then take off their hands, as opposed to just capturing them and taking off their hands. So this is the type of hell on earth that existed in all these years between 1885 and 1908, just that short period of time. 1885 and 1908. 1908, things got so bad that even the other Europeans say, you've gone too far. Now, anytime England, France, Germany, which is committing their own genocide in Southwest Africa and Namibia, Italy, when these places are saying, hey, we believe in colonization. We believe these people are savages, but this is too much. They forced the Belgian government to take over administration of the Congo. What happens in 1908? Very little changes. I mean, it's not as bad as it was in that period of time, but it's still bad. Still forced exploitation. And unlike the other European powers that at least tried to, on their face, create the image that they were actually doing something for Africa, even though they were just exploiting Africa. So the English, they would build certain schools for African elite in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria. They would build schools. They would build roads. They might build a hospital or two. They would do these things to say, look, here's an example of what Africans were before we came, and here's the great things that we've done for Africa. Yeah, we're taking resources. Yeah, we're exploiting labor. Yeah, we're having Africans fight in our tribal wars in Europe. But look at the good things. We built a school. We built a hospital. We built a road. The Belgians didn't do any of that, or very little of it. There were a few Belgian administrators that were there. They built things for them. They built roads that went to resources and went right to the coast. They built railroads that went to the resources and then back out. So these weren't for Africans. They were for the maximum exploitation of the Congo's vast resources. And at the time, again, in the early 20th century, it still wasn't known how valuable this region would be. Because at this point in the game, 2024, we know that the Congo is the richest place on earth. It's not just rubber anymore. It's coltan, it's cobalt, it's gold, it's iron ore, it's copper. Everything that you need for modern, advanced, civilization and technology, it's all in the Congo. They didn't even know about those things yet, but they were still hyper-exploiting the place. So they built very little educational institutions, very little infrastructure. They outlawed political associations. Again, even in the French colonies, the English colonies, the Portuguese colonies to some extent, there were political associations that were allowed to exist. There was the Aboriginal Protection Association in the English colonies, which would then transform into the National Council of British West Africa, or something like that. But you had these different formations. In the French colonies, of course, you had some semblance of what they call native representation. Of course, there wasn't anything that would actually change the colonial situation, but they were allowed to exist, again, in the framework of what Europeans considered civilized. So it was usually the Africans that attended the European-run schools, that went through the missionary process, all of that. They were allowed to create political associations based off of political parties in Europe and that type of thing. Again, they did none of that in the Congo. I have this picture here because hand in hand with the Belgian government, you also had European Christian churches that were involved in this exploitation as well. And of course, you have the sexual exploitation of Congolese women. These women would get pregnant and their children would be disappeared. There was a whole network of child trafficking that would take children from the Congo, from their mothers, and take them to orphanages in Europe, never to see the Congo again, never to see their parents again. All types of atrocities going on. So this happened from 1885 all the way through into the 1960s. To the 1950s. By the time we get to 1960, the Belgians see the writing on the wall. You know, this is after World War II. Western Europe is in shambles. The Africans they never really stopped, but the intensity of the demand for independence really picks up after 1945. So the Belgians see the writing on the wall the same way the English and the French and the other colonial powers do, and they realize, all right, we're going to have to change strategies again. Just like we had to end slavery to start colonization, we got to end colonization because the Africans aren't putting up with it anymore, and we need to move into a new form of exploitation of Africa, neo-colonization. But in order to do that, we have to, again, show that we've changed. Just like slavery showed that we changed. Now, we don't believe in slavery anymore. We believe in colonization. We don't believe in colonization anymore. You're allowed to be politically independent, but we believe in neo-colonization. We won't call it that. Just like we won't call colonization neo-slavery. We will call it political independence with an economic relationship. We'll call it something like that. We'll make all types of little nicknames for Commonwealth countries or be part of the French community, all these types of things. So, 1960, the Belgians rush and they say, all right, we're having elections. We're having elections. 1959, they announced, we're having elections. The population, again, very no political associations or very little political associations. In a territory about a third the size of the United States, you have about 200 college-educated people, maybe. Very limited economic, internal economic infrastructure being built. Everything is directed toward the outside. And you just rush and say, all right, we're having elections. The Congolese people rise to the challenge because they want independence. And they ended up electing on June 24th, and these dates are important. June 24th, 1960, they elect a government to be led by the Congolese National Movement, led by a young, I think he was a postal clerk, if I'm remembering correctly. I think Lumumba was a postal clerk. A young postal clerk named Patrice Lumumba. Excuse me. Lumumba ran in these rushed elections on a platform that he was going to do right by all the Congolese. You have to remember, the Belgian Congo is just a made-up territory, not a made-up territory, but the borders are just completely made up, negotiated among Europeans. So what you get in this vast territory, you had different kingdoms that existed in the pre-colonial period. You had people that weren't in monarchies, that were in more democratic situations, different ethnic groups, different nations, all thrown together. This is the same story throughout Africa, all thrown together in this thing called the Congo. So at independence, Lumumba looks at the situation, he says, look, yeah, we had these different political entities that existed before colonization, but it's in our best interest, at least right now, to all be united. We all felt the horror of colonization. We all were exploited, and for us to build a better future, we all need to be united in this new nation. And he ran on that. And it spoke to the young people, it spoke to the women, it spoke to the working class folks, and they voted for his party. Because other political parties, they were more regional. They were more for, one was for the reestablishment of the Congo Kingdom. One was for this a region called Katanga. And they weren't really thinking about the interests of all Congolese people. So they didn't win. He won. On June 24th, 1964, he's elected prime minister. And this is the same time that Belgium is about to give independence. And he took over an army that was controlled by Belgian officers. That's really important. It's an important lesson for the rest of Africa as well. When he takes over, when Belgium grants Congo independence, he gives up and gives a speech. Well, actually, he wasn't supposed to give a speech. So he's been elected prime minister. And at the time, the crown prince of Belgium is there to kind of hand over independence to the Congolese. And he gives this BS speech about all the great things that the Belgians brought to the Congo. And he's talking about this, that, and the third. And then he sits down, and Lumumba gets up, even though he wasn't on the list for speakers. And he says, I can't let that go, that this man just got up here and talked about all the great things that the Belgians did for the Congo. Let me tell you the truth. And he lays this out, embarrassing the crown prince of Belgium. Okay, of course the West wasn't going to let that stand. He basically marked his death with that speech. What ends up happening? One of the people that lost the election was a guy by the name of Moise Tshombe. Tshombe is the one on the right. The one on the left is another sellout by the name of, what's his name? Mobutu. I don't know how I forgot his name. Mobutu and Tshombe. Mobutu at this time is an officer in the military. Tshombe is the leader of the region known as Katanga, which is in southeastern Congo. Incredibly minerally rich place. Now, Tshombe is the sellout. Because when Lumumba becomes prime minister, his immediate thought is, how do we use the vast resources of Congo for the Congolese people? One of the ways we have to do that, we have to have all these companies that are operating, American, French, Belgian, English, German, all of these companies that are extracting resources, they have to pay taxes that are, equitable to what they're extracting in order for our people to benefit from the resources. Well, Tshombe says on July 15th, so Lumumba's elected president Prime Minister, June 24th. This is a statement made by Shambe, July 15th. And again, Shambe had run for Prime Minister and lost. They, the people of Katanga, do not think they can support the decision taken by Mr. Lumumba to break off diplomatic relations with Belgium, to which they believe they are indebted for their economic and social development, their well-being, and their prosperity. This is what he said. He's indebted to the Belgians for his economic and social development, their well-being and prosperity. All the things that I'm just outlined to you about what the Belgians did in the Congo, this man is saying he's indebted to them. When Lumumba was trying to break off diplomatic relations, because he could see the Belgians were trying to go around him and use the military and these other forces to, degrade what he was trying to do. So what does Shambe do? Who is Shambe? Shambe was educated by American missionaries in Congo. He was committed to maintaining European mining relations and interests in his region, not for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of himself. So he formed these relationships with these mining conglomerates. He wanted a loose federation with more hands in the power of regional presidents at the time of independence. Like I said, his position and the position of other folks in different areas of the Congo, if I can't be prime minister, then I want my region to have more autonomy. So I don't have to listen to Lumumba, so I can still engage in these practices of selling out to these European mining interests and other folks. That's what he wanted. So what happens? Again, June 24th, Lumumba is elected prime minister. August 12th, 1960, UN troops enter Katanga under Shambe's terms, because the military is still under control of the Belgians, so Lumumba doesn't feel like he can rely on his own military. So he asks the UN for help, because Katanga, Shambe's region, essentially declares independence because Lumumba broke off diplomatic relations with the Belgians. So Katanga declares independence, UN troops come in, but they come in under Shambe's terms. So it's not even really an offensive force. September 5th, 1960, President Kasavubu, another member of the government that was always at odds with Lumumba, who had lost the election, but was given the title of president, which was kind of honorary, he announced that he was revoking Lumumba's appointment as prime minister. And in turn, Lumumba revoked him as president. So it was kind of this back and forth. September 14th, Army Chief of Staff Mobutu, so that is him. He's the Army Chief of Staff, Mobutu. He announced he was assuming power and neutralizing both Kasavubu and Lumumba. He said, I'm taking both of them out of power. Now, Mobutu has been trained by the Belgians. He's in contact with the Americans. December 1st, 1960, after leaving, say again? Okay. All right, sorry about that. We dropped off for a second. Am I still, I can't tell if I'm good? Looks like it's frozen. Okay, we're having some technical issues. See, this is what happens when you start talking about the Congo and you start talking about what really went down, that's when the technical issues start. Because this is information that, and also, by the way, going, and I think it was still, it's good? Okay, a little choppy, but good. Right down the street from where we're at. So we're at 235 Montreal Road. If you keep going up Montreal Road, if you keep going west on Montreal Road becomes Rideau, and you keep going down Rideau goes right past Parliament. A lot of these discussions about what was going to happen with Lumumba occurred with the Canadian Prime Minister as well, who was on board with the United States, the Belgians, and the French saying, we got to get this guy out of here. Because what Lumumba is doing by just saying the Congolese people deserve the Congolese resources, he is disrupting the profits of American, Belgian, French, and Canadian companies that are operating in the Congo. He has to go. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you play that video, please?
The man in charge, the Belgian, called me into his office and said, "Okay, are you going to take care of this?" And I said, "All right, but what do I have to do?"
The Katangans denied he was dead. They denied everything. It was absolutely crazy.
We cut the bodies up into pieces. They were buried twice.
Pause it for a second. So what happened? The army put Lumumba on. Lumumba leaves his house in order to try to get to a region where his supporters are. To continue to run the country and continue to make moves. He was captured by the army. To his house and putting him under even more strict house arrest. They take him to Katanga. The army takes Lumumba and they drop him off in Katanga with Shambe. Has him assassinated. This is the last picture of Patrice Lumumba as he's being taken to the province of Katanga, which is separated from the Congo. And again, this happens. He's elected in June. Or the officials that were present, that were French, that were orchestrated all this, because this wasn't done. Mobutu didn't operate off. This was done, orchestrated by the West in order to remove Lumumba. Folks that are talking were people that were actually there. Go ahead, Danny, go ahead and play it. I just wanted to give that.
We cut them up into pieces, we burned them, and we also had huge quantities of acid, like you have in car batteries. So most of each body was dissolved. And then the rest, we burned them. But we had to do all this without the black scene, in the middle of the forest. That was a problem too. There were two of us, just the two, and we had to do all that on our own. Get the three bodies out of the ground, cut them into pieces and destroy them, and nobody was to know about it. And nobody did. Nobody knew what happened.
There were all kinds of stories about Lumumba's death. He was supposed to have escaped, stolen a car, been killed by some villagers who recognized him. But nobody believed any of that for a second.
Even the Belgian Minister for Africa, one of those pulling the strings behind the scenes, contributed to the cover-up with false telegrams.
I went there the next day. As soon as I arrived at the airport, I was told he was dead.
I wonder how you reacted to this news. What was your reaction?
Oh, I said, good riddance. What else would you expect me to say?
For you, it was the kind of solution of all problems?
Yes.
He was happy.
Happy, not perhaps the word. You're busy. Here's one problem going, now what's the next problem?
3 weeks later, the story was Lumumba and his accomplices massacred by villagers. Just one of countless lies. The whole truth only came to light 10 years later. None of the murderers or the men behind them has ever been indicted. Lumumba wrote a last letter from prison.
I often remember a sentence from that letter which said, "To my children whom I'm leaving."
To my children who I'll never see again, I'd like to say Congo has a magnificent future.
Tell them the future of Congo will be magnificent, and that he expects them, as he expects of every Congolese, to do their sacred duty.
There are even people who believe he will return. Now he'll have to come back with 2 front teeth missing.
You're Europeans. I think this image, and I'm not Jewish, I'm black, recalls the Holocaust. Their bodies were burned. Their body fat was used as fertilizer. Their gold teeth were taken as war booty. And that's called a crime against humanity. It's as simple as that.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So, yeah, that one's always hard to watch for me because it's the smugness of those Europeans talking about what they did. But yeah, this is all, again, you orchestrated by the West, but you couldn't have done it without Shambe. You couldn't have done it without somebody and Mobutu, who would go on to rule the Congo up into the 1990s, being the ultimate sellout. So you are responsible for Lumumba's death. You then rule the Congo and rob the country blind, and then when it's time for you go live the rest of your life out in France, while you're the country, the richest country in the world in terms of material wealth, which should be the richest country in the world, is one of the poorest, and again, engulfed in chaos, which continues, and which has a ripple effect throughout Africa. So one of the things that we see, let me get the cursor on here. Not long after this, one of the leaders that's watching all this unfold that attempted to send troops to help Lumumba was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. 1957, Nkrumah becomes the prime minister of Ghana. Nkrumah says Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it's tied up with the liberation of the entire African continent. He was very clear on that. Not everybody in Ghana felt like that. Not everybody in Ghana wanted Ghana's resources to be used to help liberate the rest of Africa. So when Nkrumah sent troops to the Congo to help Lumumba, there were folks in Ghana not happy with that. There were folks in Ghana not happy with Nkrumah using Ghana's resources to help other countries get independence. People weren't happy with Nkrumah talking about socialism, talking about the end to colonialism. They weren't happy with Nkrumah prophesizing neo-colonialism because he's watching what's happening in the Congo, and he says, when we get flag independence, it's meaningless unless we have the economic and military power to actually make our own decisions. It's meaningless. And one of the ways that we should be able to do that, we're not going to survive as these independent, 50-something independent countries. Because number one, our militaries were not designed to fight against external forces. An African army, the way that they're designed, they're not really built because they were constructed by Europeans. There's never been a reconstruction of African armies in any real meaningful way. They still have the same organizational structure as European armies. They damn near wear the same uniforms as European armies. They get trained by American and European armies. There hasn't really been a reconstruction of that. So he's saying in order for us to really be independent, we're going to have to form larger political units and economic units, particularly on a continental scale. Unless there's the United States of Africa, every country in Africa is going to be weakened. That's Nkrumah's vision. He has these all-African people's conferences where he's bringing independent movements from places from territories that aren't yet free from colonialism. He's bringing forces to Ghana to train them militarily, economically, politically. This is what you should do to get freedom. And once freedom is obtained, let's form this closer relationship leading to a United States of Africa so we never have to worry about that type of exploitation again. That's what he's working for. But again, not everybody in Ghana is feeling that. And again, it's okay to have different political visions. We're not all going to think the same politically. Nkrumah had one strategy, other people had others. So it's not selling out just because you have a different vision of things. You know, it's okay to be wrong. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. And that's not saying Nkrumah did everything right. But it's when you take that next step to say, I don't like this political vision. I don't like the way things are going. So instead of struggling internally to try to change that, I'm going to ally myself with Western powers. And it's not just I don't like the political vision for everybody. I don't like the political vision for my own individual future. It's going to mean less profits for me and my family, less profits, less my ability to exploit masses. So I'm going to ally myself with Western interests in order to get this figure out. So again, and if you want to read more about Nkrumah's thoughts, he writes a book called The Challenge of the Congo, right after the Lumumba incident, where he talks about what happened and what this means for the rest of Africa. It's where he's really laying out his arguments. He's saying what happened in the Congo is going to happen to every one of us unless we make some substantial systematic changes in terms of our economic policies, our political policies, and our military policies. We're all going to end up like Congo because all of our militaries have been trained and controlled by Western forces. So we got to do something about this. Africa must unite, neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. He writes these books outlining all this in the 1960s. I'll go back. I'm going a little fast just so I can get to our first break. Who were the sellouts in Ghana? The National Liberation Council. The National Liberation Council. By the time we get to 1966, the CIA has decided that Nkrumah is too dangerous to remain in power in Ghana. He's talking about Africa uniting. He's been the main force in Africa talking about a United States of Africa. That actually ends up transforming itself into a compromise organization called the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, which you had some states that were for Nkrumah's vision of a United States of Africa. Then you had a lot of states that were allied with Western interests that didn't want that. And for their own personal interests, they said, we don't want that. We would rather be the king of a little area than the governor of a little area. So that was their position. And of course, the West was all involved in that as well. So they don't like these moves that Nkrumah's making. The fact that he is helping fighters from what becomes Zimbabwe and South Africa train, and he's using Ghana's resources to liberate the rest of Africa. He's making news on the international stage because he's telling countries in Latin America, in Asia, hey, be non-aligned. Don't fall into this U.S. Soviet Union BS. You know, take aid, if it's true aid, from either one, but don't ally yourself to the United States. Don't ally yourself to the Soviet Union. Be allied to your own interests. So the United States doesn't want people talking about that. They want people on their side in their Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. So for all of these reasons, Nkrumah is seen as a threat. Anybody talking about using African resources for African people is a threat. Lumumba was a threat for that reason, and Nkrumah was a threat for this reason. So the CIA orchestrated, and with the help of the Ghana military and the Ghanaian police, Operation Cold Chop. That's the name of the operation. You can look it up. You can read it. You can see all the CIA declassified documents about all this. That video you saw about Lumumba, we're able to see all that now because this stuff has been declassified, because they don't even care anymore about keeping it secret about the things that were done to Africa to destabilize it. So 1966, Operation Cold Chop happens. The National Liberation Council wait until Nkrumah is abroad. He's going to Vietnam to try to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War in 1966. But when he gets to China, the military and the police force decide we're going to take over the country. And there's a military coup, and Nkrumah and his party, the Convention People's Party, are ousted from power. And Nkrumah then goes on to become a co-president in Guinea-Conakry. And Ghana, again, goes down the path that a number of African states go down in the 20th century. Democratically elected leaders, military leaders, back to democracy, back to military leaders, back and forth again. And every now and again, you would get a leader that was actually dedicated to the people, and then either the military would be used to oust them, or they would be, if they were a military leader that was dedicated to the people, the West would say, look, this is not democratic, there's a military leader, get him out. And if it was an elected leader that was for the people, the West would use the military to get them out, to depose them. This was the back and forth in Africa in the 20th century, and it continues to this day in a lot of places. All right, let's take a break. Peter, let me get this on the screen one more time. All right. Oh, okay, yeah. The sellouts were committed to maintaining a relationship with Europe and the West. Many of these leaders received their training in various British officers' training institutions. So that still hasn't stopped. We'll stop there for a second. We'll take a break, and then we'll go a little bit further. Prince, go ahead.
So I think you were mentioning that like Patrice Lumumba won the election based on kind of the concept of unity of the region. I'm just wondering how much support Chambé had, given that that was how he won and that was how Patrice Lumumba got elected. Did he have the actual support of the people in ousting?
Chambé was able to garner support in Katanga, in that region, because of, he was known in the region. He was a power broker in the region. There was a lot of, I hate to use the word tribalism, but tribalism. And Chambé was able to build himself up off that platform. Kind of like Trump. That actually goes with what David H. said. Chambé was kind of like, this region, I'm going to build it up. I'm going to build, that we're the best region, and I have this relationship with the Belgians, and I think that's the best way to go. And nobody else in the rest of the people that were voting felt like that. So that's why he didn't win, because, people assumed that he was going to place Katanga's interests over the rest of the country. And that's why he didn't win. And ultimately, when he loses, the folks in Katanga, that he's able to, again, go back to Katanga and say, okay, we lost. Now the federal government is going to come at us and oppress us. So you need to support me and be anti-Lumumba. So he started this whole anti-Lumumba. Lumumba's a communist. Lumumba's this, that, and the third, in order to build up that hostility in the region. But at the same time, again, just like Trump lying to the people, he wasn't going to do anything for the actual people in Katanga. He was doing things for himself and the American and Belgian and French businesses that operated in Katanga. So yeah, he was able to build that cult of personality around himself using all those tactics that folks use. Patronage, all of that. Yeah.
Another question, and this is kind of unrelated to it, but you mentioned the Commonwealth. So that concept, I'm just curious about how that works, because I've heard it referred to, and the name itself just sounds odd, because what I see often is that like you have European kings and queens and they talk about the Commonwealth, and then they showcase people from different colonies who are usually not as well off as they are.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering about that construct, how it works, and it's just largely about extracting resources.
Yeah, so all the ins and outs I'm not as familiar with as I am, say, the French community one, because that one is much more explicit about what France did with African currencies and preferential treatment and trade and all that. The Commonwealth isn't as exploitative as that, but it still maintains this relationship with the UK, with the Crown, with the government, that it's almost, it's not required that you give preferential treatment in trade, but it's kind of there. There's all these, it's really a soft power type relationship. It's still a way of not completely breaking yourself from English control. Your government is still parliamentary. You're still wearing the powdered wigs. You're still recognizing the Queen and now the King and all that stuff. So it's more of a, let me get back to you, because I don't want to speak out of turn. I will come back next week and give you a better answer in terms of the economic relationship. Maybe somebody else on here can speak to it better than me. But definitely in terms of the soft power aspect of it is there. But somebody might be able to speak on it better than me, but I'm gonna bring a better answer next week, because I'm much more familiar with the French one. Other questions? Comments?
I don't see any more questions, but somebody did post a comment that says, according to Wikipedia, on July 29th, 1960, Lumumba went to Ottawa to request help. The Canadians rebuffed the request for technicians and said they would channel their assistance through the United Nations.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister at the time basically said, yeah, this guy, we got to get rid of him. It's not in the interest of Canada for him to be Prime Minister anymore. So yeah, these are the things that are happening right down the street. When we talk about the situation that's going on in Haiti right now, Justin Trudeau just said something about Haiti in some interview recently, because these decisions are being made when the decision was made to kidnap Aristide. in 2004. That was all negotiated right up the street at the, what's that hotel up there? The Chateau Laurier. The French officials, Canadian officials, U.S. officials, they all get together, talk about these things, and set the political and economic destiny for African people, Caribbean people, folks in Latin America. They do this. And we have to understand that. As people that are here, that are right down the street, that have a voice, that can go up there and talk to these folks and say, hey, you know, we're not just worried about what's going on in Canada in terms of the next election and, you know, people's pronouns in school and pipelines and all these other issues that are particularly for the country. We're also concerned about what you're doing to our people back home. Not many of us put that on the federal agenda. When they have these debates, even if you watch the last Trump-Harris debate, nobody asked about Africa. Nobody asked about extraterritorial obligations and these types of things in these debates. And black folks, and I'm particularly talking, and I'm using black folks in particular, my apologies, David H. I'm talking about Afro-descendant people that were born in the United States. They don't ask these questions to Harris when she's at the National Association of Black Journalists. Yeah, they're asking about, you know, police brutality and these things and racial discrimination in the United States, which is cool. But nobody's asking about Haiti. Nobody's asking, or they're asking about Haiti now because of the remarks Trump made about Haitian people eating people's pets, which was crazy. But they're not asking about Africa. They're not asking about the next thing that we're going to talk about in a minute, which is AFRICOM. Nobody, that's not on anybody's radar. Everybody's cool with AFRICOM. We'll talk about that in a second. Actually, let me get back into it. So, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Africa is getting independence, and these nations are going through that same process that you saw in Congo and Ghana. Every now and again, and I say every now and again because it wasn't the norm, you would get a leader that actually was allied with the masses of the population. Sometimes that leader would get to live out their term and do things. You got people like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who's a model that we can look at. He did his term and then he was done. And then he, you know, lived the rest of his life. And Tanzania was on a pretty good path. You know, he was relatively pragmatic. He practiced this African socialism called Ujamaa, and they were able to, you know, do different things in Tanzania. One of the good ones. Few and far between. Most leaders, whether they were military or democratically elected, and we got to put the asterisk next to that, because, you know, it's so funny the hypocrisy in the West, in the United States and Canada. You see all these officials and folks that are getting arrested in jail time for, oh, they worked with foreign forces to influence our election. You see that all the time in the news in the United States and Canada. Yet, those same countries use all types of influence in other people's elections. So we had to put even an asterisk next to these democratic elections, because most of them aren't democratic at all. So whether it's a military takeover or change through democracy, oftentimes the folks that would get in would be antithetical to the aspirations of the masses of African people. But every now and again, you would get the example of the one that in my little map got altered when it got translated. But we're talking about Upper Volta. So don't pay attention to the big map. But we're talking about Upper Volta, which got independence in 1960. Again, one of these French colonies that entered that French economic community, that choice that African nations were given by the French in 1957, where they said, hey, you can have, say it again? Oh, good. Okay. The French community, the French said, hey, you can get independence, complete independence, or you can join this French economic community where you have independence, but we still control your currency, and your currency has to be in a French bank, and we have preferential access to your resources, so on and so forth. Everybody but Guinea said yes to that. In Burkina Faso, or actually it was called Upper Volta then, 1960, you got a neo-colonial leader that kind of goes with that flow, and that kind of continues. The country is decimated with poverty and other things. By the time we get to 1983, a young military officer named Thomas Sankara with a group of military officers, they don't like the direction the country is going in. They're actually for the masses of the people. They take over the government. Thomas Sankara, young guy, wants to completely change the nation. He's family man. I just love this picture of Thomas Sankara with his family. First policy, in order for people to change, they have to believe that change can actually occur. So working on the national self-esteem. So Upper Volta, what's that? That's some European colonizer name for the territory. We're going to call it Burkina Faso, the land of the upright people. The land of the upright people. It's one of the first things that they did. They changed the name of the country, changed the flag. Then his policies in office, food security. Food security. We have to grow our food. We can't be reliant on the West to give us food. If you're dependent in that type of way, you'll never be independent. If you're dependent on the West for food, for machinery, for economic development, you're not really free. He realized that. So food security, women's rights, environmental protection. Burkina Faso was right in the Sahel, that area where the Sahara meets the grasslands in Africa. Even in the 1980s, Sankara and his government realized that we're going to have a problem, particularly moving forward, if global trends keep going as they are, lack of rainfall, the Sahara advancing. We need to focus on environmental policies. We need to regreen this place, grow trees, that type of thing. Practice better forms of agriculture so we don't disrupt the land, all of that. Increase human development by building hospitals, schools, better roads that actually, encourage intra-country trade. Fighting against corruption, an end to foreign dependency. He was fighting for African unity. The ideas that Nkrumah had about a United States of Africa and Pan-Africanism and working with yet-to-be-liberated places like Rhodesia and South Africa and fighting against apartheid in the 1980s. These were all the things that Sankara and his government were doing, and they were having effect. He eventually stops. You go back to this image. He makes a mandate that all government officials have to wear clothes that were made in Burkina Faso. Let's move away from wearing these Western suits. Let's actually give some business to our tailors that make beautiful clothes. It seems like a little thing, like, oh, it's just aesthetics, but it goes a long way. He told the officials in the government, we're not buying any of these more luxury cars for you to drive around with while the people starve. You can get to where you're going in a Honda just as quickly as you get in the BMW. And it wasn't Honda, it was some other, bargain car brand. But he said, if we have to set the example for the nation, we are servants of the people. So we should have salaries comparable to servants. At the time of his death, all he owned was a guitar, a bicycle, and, he lived a modest life because he wanted that to be the example. If the country is poor, we all should be poor. I mean, that's the reality of it. Until the country is wealthy, then we can start talking about, being flashy and all this. But right now, it's a time of sacrifice. And I can't ask the people to sacrifice if I'm not going to sacrifice. He didn't live in some fancy mansion. Him and his wife, they lived in a simple house. And he ran the country like that. And he tried to do everything that he could to get his country on a path to sustainable development, while at the same time being militant, going around the world, going to Harlem, speaking to African Americans, saying, hey, your struggle is our struggle. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa is all of African people's struggle. These are the messages that he was sending around the African world. You can read his speeches. And it's not just his rhetoric. Again, it's his policies, environmental policies, women's rights policies, educational policies, food production policies. These were things that were written into law that were changing the situation in Burkina Faso. And again, that second to last one, ending foreign dependency, telling the French, we no longer need this exploitative relationship that we have with you. We don't want it. It doesn't benefit us. We want to end this. Well, of course, France doesn't like that. So what do? They find a sellout, one of his closest friends, Blaise Compaoré. You see him up here shaking hands with Sankara? He led a coup d'etat 4 years later, 1987, October 15th, 1987. They go into Sankara's office. He orchestrates it. Sankara is killed. He's assassinated. He restored relationships with France and the West during his time that he ran Burkina Faso. From 1987 to 2014, he was in charge. And you see him there with the Obamas because American presidents love taking pictures with sellouts. I mean, it's like a good thing. They come to the White House, they get wined and dined, all that stuff. By the time we get to 2014, though, the masses in Burkina Faso are tired of the corruption. They're tired of him staying in power. And there's a mass movement to overthrow him. And they do. When they do, he runs away to Ivory Coast, nation right across the border. He's tried in absentia and found guilty for the murder and political assassination of Thomas Sankara. But he's still alive walking around in Burkina Faso. In fact, he actually crossed the border, I think a couple of weeks ago, and went back into Burkina Faso for a couple of days and didn't get arrested. Recently, he released this. Daniel, could you play the video on Burkina Faso? So give you some up-to-date information about what's going on with this sellout.
Reactions have begun to follow the apology by Burkina Faso's former president, Blaise Compaoré. In a letter read out to the media on Tuesday, the former Burkinabe leader asked the family of Thomas Sankara and the Burkinabe people for forgiveness for all the crimes committed under his rule. You have not been condemned or punished yet. You have not even recognized your acts. You deny justice. You even defy it. And at the end of the chain, when you see that there's no other way out, you come and ask for forgiveness. This is a forced pardon. It's as if he was forced to ask for forgiveness. In Ouagadougou, the opinions of Burkinabe citizens are mixed, as they consider the manner and sincerity of the request for pardon of the former head of state sentenced in absentia to life in jail for the 1987 assassination of Thomas Sankara. Given that the sentence has already been passed and that he recognizes that he was wrong and wants to apologize, I think we should really put all that aside and then work together to be able to be strong in the face of this situation. For me, it's first of all a gesture that should be welcomed. I am still frustrated by the letter. What is my frustration? Well, in fact, I feel that since the beginning, the issue of justice has been obscured. If they had simply put at the end of the letter, I place myself at the disposal of my country's justice system, I would have applauded this. Compaoré has been living in exile in neighboring Ivory Coast since being ousted from power by mass protest in 2014. He returned to Burkina Faso for several days this month without facing arrest.
This is the situation. This is the situation. You got this constant retarding of African progress. Thomas Sankara does this thing. One of his close friends assassinated him, and he gets to live the rest of his life. This is the part that angers so many people. That he's given out this apology and he's not faced justice. He's not even in jail. He's in the neighboring country, and he has the audacity to go back, and nobody arrested him. This is what we're dealing with. Again, the people overthrowing. But one of the reasons why he's able to operate like this, and so many leaders are able to operate, or misleaders are able to operate the way they are throughout the African continent, is the establishment of the United States Africa Command in 2007. So this was done under the presidency of George W. Bush. This is a military initiative designed to ensure that there will always be a cadre of sellouts throughout the African continent. It's not just about having U.S. military bases in the region for U.S. purposes. I mean, it's all for U.S. purposes and purposes of the West. It's also for training African military leaders not to have allegiance to the masses that they're supposed to serve, but to have allegiance to the United States. And the leaders that allowed AFRICOM to operate in their nations have sold out their people. Because it's actually a human rights violation in Africa. If you read the African Charter for Human and People's Rights, one of the aspects of it is there should not be aggressive military forces, military installations in Africa. It's actually there. It's actually spelled out. So it's actually illegal that these are there. But nonetheless, this was started by, the first general that was over AFRICOM was William E. Ward. And I'm not listing him here as a sellout, because he's not. He's not a sellout. Because he, as I mentioned in my nuanced understanding of sellouts, he never positioned himself to be any type of African leader or leader of African American people or their social movements. He's a career military man. So his allegiance is very clear. He's allied to the interests of the United States. So, but it is funny that every leader of AFRICOM, the United States is smart in that way. I think there's been 6 commanders, and maybe only one of them has been white, or maybe none of them have been white. But the vast majority of them have been African Americans for optics. The United States, we're not a colonizing power. Look, we send black people to be the head of it. We got chocolate leaders. Anyway, you see him there with Paul Kagame, another dictator in Africa, been in charge of Rwanda since 1994. Has done a lot to destabilize Eastern Congo. So again, these pictures with African misleaders are common. So he was the first. The current, and of course they show pictures like this, because this is what they want the world to think AFRICOM is doing. It's just like the pictures they show with the police playing ball with kids in the neighborhood. It's like it's a way to show that we're not bad. We're not here to hurt anybody. Anyway, if you look at this map, these are all the military installations throughout the continent of Africa. And you see other places in the world, but I just wanted you to look at how many are in Africa. The ones that are yellow are for training and assistance, quote unquote. The ones that are green are actually U.S. military exercises where they've actually been there. And the ones that are blue, with the stars, those are military bases. So there's one in Senegal, there's one in Burkina Faso, there's one in Ghana. The ones in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are actually closed because there have been military coups in those 3 countries in the past 5 years that are actually, at least from their rhetoric, they're saying they're for the people. I'm still holding off judgment on those revolutions. They've done some good things in terms of kicking the U.S. and France out, but I still want to see what their other policies are if they're actually for the people. So those are countries to actually watch. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. There have been 3 military coups in the past 5 years in those regions, and those leaders have positioned themselves, at least rhetorically, as heirs to Thomas Sankara. I'm still looking at their policies to see what that plays out internally, but it's trending toward positive. But we'll keep our eye out on it, because they did kick out those military forces of France and the United States. But these other places, Kenya, and you see Kenya is, again, a major player in upholding U.S. interests. So much so that they not only hold up U.S. interests in Africa, they got Kenyan forces holding up U.S. interests in Haiti against the actual desires of the Kenyan people, who just exploded a couple of months ago when the youth said enough. So you see military in Ghana. They even have a George Bush Road in Ghana. So this is the type of, in the nation of Nkrumah, they have a George Bush Road and a military base. In Botswana, Congo, all these places. But the more insidious ones are the training areas, because you can close a military base. You can kick them out in that regard. But when you invite them in to train your forces, what are they training them to do? They say it's quote unquote anti-terrorism training. We're fighting Africans to fight against terrorism, terrorism that's caused by U.S. policies in other places around the world. The current leader of AFRICOM is a guy by the name of Michael E. Langley. Again, they always get black men to be the AFRICOM commanders. AFRICOM really showed its ability to influence things on the continent with the 2011 invasion of Libya. You had Muammar Gaddafi, again, perfect leader, not by any stretch of the imagination. But what was Gaddafi? And again, Gaddafi made a lot of mistakes. But the one mistake Gaddafi didn't make was the free rent they had in Libya, the free education that they had in Libya, the beautiful infrastructure that was built in Libya, the man-made river that brought water to different populations in Libya, the fact that Gaddafi, toward the end of the 1990s and the 2000s, was talking about, again, the United States of Africa, Africa ending its dependency on the West and other forces, Africa having a common currency, military, all those things that Nkrumah and Sankara were talking about. Gaddafi was talking about and implementing, putting his money where his mouth was, that's too much for the West. 2011, Gaddafi is overthrown in a Western-backed operation where the responsibility to protect protesters was used as the rationale. Just like King Leopold used, I'm going to end the slave trade to go into Congo, we're going to protect citizens was the rationale to go into Libya. Long story short, Gaddafi is overthrown, that government is overthrown, and one of the people that overthrew that government was a guy named General Haftar. General Khalifa Haftar, who was one of the generals with Gaddafi in 1969 that overthrew the monarchy that existed in Libya. So backing up a little bit, Libya got independence from Italy in the 50s under a monarchy. So it went from Italian control to the control of a monarchy based in the city of Benghazi, King Idris I. King Idris was allied with the Italians and the other Western interests that had oil interests in Libya. The military officers, just like Sankara would do later on, young military officers led by Muammar Gaddafi overthrew that king and established the modern Libyan state. The people in Benghazi never forgot about that, and that's where this anti-Gaddafi movement actually kicked off. But one of those generals, General Khalifa Haftar, eventually has a falling out with Gaddafi. He actually then gets captured in Chad. He's doing some military operations against Libya in Chad. He gets captured by the United States. And you would think, well, what's going to happen to him? The United States used taxpayers' money to set up Khalifa Haftar in Virginia for 20 years. From the 1980s to 2011, Khalifa Haftar is living in Virginia, waiting for the opportunity to go back to Libya. So his children are being educated in the United States. He's living in a house paid for by U.S. taxpayers, all under the protection of the United States. 2011, he's let back into Libya. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing that video.
The road to Tripoli. This is General Haftar's self-styled militia. It's substantial and it's moving west in a bid to take the capital. General Haftar, who's now on the move, controls the south and the east of the country. He's set his sights on the Libyan capital. The United Nations-backed government, based in Tripoli, is supported by a range of militias. In order to defend the city, militias that support the UN-backed government are deploying their own troops to fend off General Haftar's offensive. But Haftar, who ordered his troops to take the capital on Thursday, is determined.
Heroes, the time has come. It is time to advance, as you have always done, with a firm step towards Tripoli and to enter it peacefully.
For Libyans, this is another escalation in a long and gritty power struggle. Conflict has rumbled on since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, with militias vying for power and control of Libya's oil. The international community is worried. The head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, was in Tripoli this week speaking with both General Haftar and the UN-backed government. Just before leaving Libya on Friday evening, he talked of hope.
With a deep concern and a heavy heart, I still hope it will be possible to avoid a bloody confrontation in and around Tripoli, and the United Nations remain available to facilitate any political solution able to unify the Libyan institutions. And whatever happens, the UN will remain committed, and I will remain committed to support the Libyan people.
But hope seems to be running out. Near the capital, Haftar's forces are clashing with the militias that support the UN-backed government. The situation is uncertain, but Haftar's advance is unlikely to bring peace. The risk is renewed civil war.
For more on the situation in Libya, we're joined by Mona Hefni of DW's Arabic service. Mona, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Militia forces commanded by Khalifa Haftar, they're advancing on the capital. The UN-backed government in Tripoli has sent out its militias in an attempt to stop them. Tell us, how serious is the situation?
It is quite serious right now because, as we have seen, fighting has been ongoing yesterday night around the former international airport of Tripoli. Also, after the meeting of UN General Guterres with Haftar, the UN envoy to Libya, Ghassan Salama, said that Haftar made it obvious that he had no interest in halting the campaign. And it is quite obvious that Haftar is determined to take over the capital. So it is quite serious.
Tell us more about Khalifa Haftar. What exactly is he trying to achieve?
He is a quite powerful man. He has quite a rich history. He has helped Gaddafi to overthrow the former king of Libya. Then afterwards, while he was in Chad, he was captured for almost 20 years. Afterwards, he moved to exile in the US. And worked for the CIA there, and he helped for the fall of Gaddafi afterwards in 2011. Now his most important aim is to take over the capital, of course, because the one who takes over the capital is the one in power, basically.
If he succeeds, what could happen if the UN-backed government fails?
It is quite unclear what will happen right now, because we could have one scenario which is quite similar to the Egyptian scenario, with cracking down the Muslim Brotherhood, which is centered in the capital right now. But the thing is that other countries around Libya might be also endangered, because he has threatened last year Algeria to start a war. And he has said that he will move up to Tripoli, and then afterwards he might move to Algeria, which might mean that there will be also turbulences around Libya.
What could the international community do to stop this situation from escalating further?
I think the international community can't do very much, because first, the international community only condemns things by words. It does not really interfere, although there are also double standards, like in the Emirates, who stated that it is against this intervention, but on the other hand, or against this move, but on the other hand, it supports Haftar. So we don't really know what's happening right now. But I think in the end, not much will happen, because Haftar is not a man of words. He's a man who talks with weapons and who is determined to reach his goal.
Mona Hefni.
So you can see what was unleashed in Libya through the actions of this sellout who wanted power, sitting in the United States waiting for his opportunity, gets support by the U.S. to go back into Libya. So you got to imagine this. How does someone go from being someone that's in exile for 20 years, living in Virginia, to now having these forces amassed and about to take the capital, about to start another war? And in addition to that, what we don't talk about with the Libyan anti-revolution that happened in 2011 was the massacre that happened in Tuguera. This was done against Africans from other parts of the continent, and even dark-skinned Libyans in this town that were seen as supporters of Gaddafi, and they massacred the whole town. And it never gets attention. So this whole narrative that Gaddafi's fall was done to protect civilians is a complete sham, because it was civilians that were killed by the forces against Gaddafi. So anyway, and then it has a domino effect. What we've seen in the region since 2011 is increased insecurity throughout this entire region, not just because of the fall of Gaddafi's regime in Libya, but all the military arms that came into Libya supplied by the West and other forces, and even the Russians getting involved with the Wagner Group and these other private security forces that brought all of these weapons into the region, trying to back these different militias. And those weapons left Libya and went into places like Niger and Chad and Mali and Sudan and South Sudan. This is a current map of conflicts that are going on in Africa, and the amount of displaced people as a result of these conflicts. And again, much of this has to do with nations that are led by folks that don't care about the masses of African people, that continue to sell out those populations. They continue to sell out through bad policies. I'm not talking about making policy mistakes. Again, if you're not, the only people that don't make mistakes are people that don't do anything. So I'm not talking about people that make tactical mistakes. I'm talking about people that know. They know that their actions are selling out the masses of the population, and they're doing it to line their own pockets. South Sudan, the leaders are doing that. And it's not just selling out to the West, but as was mentioned in that video, the UAE, the Arab Emirates are all involved in this region of Africa. The Russians are all involved in this region in Africa. So it's not just the typical story of Africa versus the West. So you're seeing all this happen. And Sudan is the last place that we'll talk about because it's the most recent betrayal. In Sudan in 2019, you had the masses rise up. Women, students, workers. They rose up and they overthrew the regime of Omar al-Bashir, who had ruled Sudan for years, for decades. And it was seen as a revolution. This was the image of the revolution. The organizer, the protester, Ala Salah, this woman in white who was leading the people, and it was supposed to be a new dawn in Sudan, Africa's largest landmass, country with the largest landmass, very wealthy country in terms of oil and other resources and all that. And this sovereign council was established because even though the masses overthrew it, the military was still in place. So this sovereign council included the military, included women's rights organizations, different political parties, but the military still had still held major power in Sudan. By the time we get to about 2021, 2022, the military has essentially silenced all the other voices on this council, and they took control. And they took control, and then there was another element of the military, the Rapid Response Forces, that then, the Rapid Security Forces, the Rapid Response, it's the RSF, they end up feuding with the main military and have plunged the country into a civil war that has resulted in millions of displaced people, and I think something like 166,000 people that have been killed over the past 2 years in Sudan. The fighting just continues to happen because leaders in both the regular army as well as the RSF have allied themselves with forces outside of Sudan. One group is working with the Wagner Group in Russia, and the other group is working with the UAE and the United States and Western interests, and no one is thinking about the masses in Sudan. And this is happening right now, right as we speak. So this is something that you can actually look up. I hate to leave it on a down note, but this is the type of things that we have to consider when we talk about social revolutions, social movements. How do we create a situation where we maintain these entities without folks selling out? What do we have to do? I don't have an answer to that, to be quite frank. And we can look at these studies, these case studies that we've looked at going past 500 years. We could talk about putting structures in place to mitigate against this. We could talk about ideological considerations, spiritual considerations, all this. But we have to find an answer to this problem. So unfortunately, I don't have one. I don't have an answer to this. I'm not going to pretend to. I think all of us, if we could have some general discussion right now, if we could think about this phenomena and what we can do to fight against it. But I think the first element of fighting against is recognizing the problem. So this is kind of like a diagnosis. Like, I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor of African American and African studies, so I'm not a medical doctor. But if I was a medical doctor, this would be a diagnosis. So this is the disease that we have. We have a disease of snitches and sellouts. But as of right now, we have some treatments that we can, suggest, but trying to find a cure is what we're working on. But the first step in that is having the proper diagnosis. This is the diagnosis. We got this problem with snitches and sellouts. As African people are building social movements, trying to fight for justice, recognizing that this could be an element of anything that we try to do, let's try to create institutions and mechanisms to fight against this as much as possible. Create more democratic and collective leadership in our organizations so that one person isn't responsible for making all the decisions, so that way one person can't be corrupted or influenced to sell everybody else out. That's one mechanism that we can do. We can ask people to incorporate this into their spirituality, whether you're a Muslim, Christian, you practice traditional African religions, you practice the religion of the Hebrews, or you're Hindu, or you're Buddhist. What is your spiritual commitment to the movement that will, provide some type of countermeasure against this type of activity. Make it so that your spirit is against it. How do we inculcate this into our children? To say, hey, you know, have some character in that you won't betray your people. Like, have it be the ultimate sin, the ultimate, like, why would you do that? We have to cultivate that type of mentality in our community in order for us to move forward. Because, quite frankly, if we keep having this issue, we'll never get to where we want to be, which is sustainable and just development as a people around the globe. All that to say, I'm going to open it up to general discussion now. I do want to preview again, next week we start our Sheroes class. The announcement for that will be sent out. I think I sent out the link in the original list of classes we're going to do. I think I sent that out earlier, but I'll send it out again to everyone. And feel free to share with other people that are interested in learning about the history of African women as resistance leaders. And, you know, just spending 8 weeks talking about these courageous African women that you might not hear about in other spaces. So that's what we're doing for October and November. I always love having these conversations. I'm really looking forward to our general open discussion today. And again, always thank you all for coming and participating. So